Right, hey everyone, doing chapter 3 of Little Green Men. After 10 minutes of sitting beside Tess and saying nothing, Liz decided that the situation was going to drive her crazy. So she moved around behind the counter and started cleaning the ice cream machine. It was a job usually reserved for later in the evening, but there didn't seem to be much point in waiting now. No one but Tess had entered the crash down in over an hour. Tess sat at the counter, sipping on a glass of water and not saying anything at all. Her attention shifted from watching Liz to staring at passing cars outside. There wasn't much the two of them had to talk about on good days, and so far today had not turned out to be a good day. The radio station still said nothing about people turning green. Liz wasn't sure if that was a good sign or a bad sign. The jingling of the bell over the door almost made Liz drop the blender blade back into the ice cream machine. She eased it into the sink and turned around to see Sheriff Valenti coming. He was wearing his usual jeans and denim shirt, his hat pulled low over his face. It took Liz a moment to be sure that his skin hadn't yet turned green. "Have either of you seen Kyle?" he asked. Tess glanced at Liz, who wiped her hands on a towel as she nodded. "He went with Alex, Michael, Maria, and Max to the hospital about an hour ago." Liz could tell the news was not what Valenti wanted to hear. Not at all. Which one of them had, he hesitated, then said, "a problem." "Kyle, Alex, and Maria all had their skin turn green," Liz said. Valenti sighed, then shook his head. "I was afraid of that." "Do you know what's causing this?" Tess asked. "No," he said, moving over and standing at the end of the counter, his voice lowering as if he was telling them information he didn't want anyone else to hear, even though there was no one else in the restaurant. "But the military is quarantining off the hospital. If they're in there, they're not getting out until this is solved." "Oh no," Liz said. Thought of Max and Michael trapped inside a medical quarantine wasn't good. That was far, far too risky a place for them to be. Valenti knew the stakes involved. At first he had pursued the alien teens, but eventually he had understood that it meant no harm and had become friend and protector. "The doctors are saying this is nothing but a shift in skin pigmentation they can't explain," Valenti said. "It is not dangerous in any way." "But?" Tess asked. Valenti frowned. "But the military is insisting on treating it like a contagious plague." "Typical government thinking," Tess said, the disgust clear in her voice. "When did it become government policy to round someone up because of the color of their skin?" Liz and Valenti both looked at her in surprise. That comment made her seem truly alien, even though she was raised in the United States, just like the other two were. Liz didn't want to remind her of the history of her country and all the times that the government had rounded people up because of their skin color. Better to just let Tess vent her anger. "Do they know something we don't?" Liz asked Valenti. "Who?" "The government. Does this get worse? Is the skin the only thing affected?" He shrugged. "I've been trying to find that out, but I'm no longer in charge here. They don't have to tell me anything, but they seem as baffled by this as I am, and from some of the comments I've overheard, it seems that Roswell was the only place affected." At that moment, the door opened again, sending the bell jingling. Maria, her skin a bright green, came through first, followed by Alex, then Michael, then Max. Clearly they were being careful, with Max checking the street and Alex and Maria instantly heading to the counter. They ducked behind it, as far from the window as they could get. Liz couldn't believe the relief she was feeling, even though Maria and Alex were still green-skinned. "How did you get out?" Tess asked. "Where's Kyle?" Valenti asked at the same time. Michael answered. "We snuck out through the kitchen right as they were sealing off the hospital. We had to duck a few military transports on the way back here as well," Max said. "But I don't think anyone saw us. Kyle left and went home." Valenti nodded. He looked relieved. "Good. My suggestion is you guys stay out of sight here." "And do what?" Maria said. "I look like a lime popsicle." "I'll keep you informed as to what is going on," Valenti said. "But first I'm going to check to make sure Kyle made it home and give him the same advice." "Thanks, Sheriff," Max said, as Valenti turned and headed for the door. "Just don't do anything stupid," Valenti said. "Stay low and inside." "As if I'm going out in public looking like a green apple," Maria said. "Popsicle," Alex said. "Whatever." Isabel liked watching the movie's credits all the way to the end. It was a habit that no one else bothered with, and often she ended up alone in the theater when the lights came up. This time Rob had stayed with her, at first standing in the dark and putting on his coat, then sitting back down and waiting, pretending to be as interested as she was in the endless list of names scrolling by. It was a first date for them, so what choice did he have? Rob was a freshman at New Mexico State in Albuquerque who had graduated last year from her high school. She had seen him around, but until he came back on spring break, it had never occurred to her to go out with him. Something about that half year he'd spent in college made him much more attractive. He had filled out and was no longer the rail thin kid with big glasses. Now he wore contacts and dressed well and had a smile that could light up a room and make her heart flutter. So far, with a quick lunch before the movie, he had been great company, funny and not pushy at all. As the copyright notices rolled past and the theater lights came up, he said, "Fun movie." Isabel stood and turned to face him. She was about to say that she agreed. It had been fun, when his appearance brought her up cold. His face was a bright shade of green, as was his neck, his arms, and his hands. He clearly hadn't noticed. Then she felt an odd suspicion. Had he done this as a joke? He could have put on face paint in the men's room when he disappeared in the middle of the movie, but if he had, why would he? It didn't make sense. "What happened to you?" she blurted. He frowned, his green skin wrinkling just like regular skin. It didn't look like he was wearing pancake makeup. "What do you mean, what?" At that moment, he glanced at his hand, and the shock seemed to almost knock him back into the seat. "Is this some sort of joke?" he demanded, his voice clearly barely containing the anger and panic as he stared at both arms, then pulled his sleeve up to see the green skin there as well. Since that had been her initial response, and since he seemed surprised by the change, Isabel felt a funny kind of relief. Relief that he wasn't playing a game. "I don't think so." Isabel held up her arm to make sure it was still her normal color. Then she said, "Your face is green as well." His hands went instantly to his face, as if touching it would tell the color he couldn't see. Then he unbuttoned 2 buttons on his shirt and opened it. The skin on his chest was green. He tried to rebutton his shirt, but his hands were shaking too much. "Come on," she said, "let's get you outside where the light's better." "So your friends could laugh at their joke?" he demanded. "I don't think so." "This isn't a joke anyone I know would do," Isabel said, staring into his angry eyes, standing her ground with him. She could see just how mad he was, and she didn't blame him, not in the slightest. "Then what is this?" He held up his green hands in front of her face. "I don't know," she said, trying to keep her voice calm in the empty theater. "You may be having a reaction to something from lunch. Let's get you checked out." He stared at her for a moment, the anger slowly draining away. "No joke?" "No joke," she said. "Are you feeling all right?" "What do you mean, all right?" he asked. "I've just turned green." "I mean, are there other symptoms?" He paused, took a few tentative breaths, then shook his head. "I feel normal." "Well, there's that at least," she said. "Come on, let's take you to the emergency room." "What can they do?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe they know about some special popcorn butter that turns people green, or something. I just think you should get checked out." He nodded, the look on his oddly unfamiliar green face telling Isabel that the seriousness of the situation was suddenly sinking in. She took his arm and turned him toward the entrance. He seemed to stumble for a moment, then caught his stride as the two of them walked side by side out into the lobby of the Six Flags. The place was empty, which bothered Isabel more than it would have under normal circumstances. There wasn't anyone behind the candy counter, no kids at the half-dozen video games. The front door stood open, a light breeze blowing in. Outside, there was only a few cars left in the parking lot, one of them Rob's new Volkswagen Beetle. People should have started arriving by now for the next shows, but that clearly wasn't happening. "You better get to the hospital," a voice said from behind them. They both spun around to see a woman who had taken their tickets standing to one side of the candy counter, half hidden by a wall, as if afraid to come out. "Why?" Isabel demanded. "That's where the other green people went," the woman said. "Go to the hospital." "There were others who turned green?" Rob asked. "Yeah, 3 or 4 in your show alone," the hidden woman said. Whatever had happened to Rob was happening to others as well. She glanced at Rob. For the first time, fear filled his eyes. "Come on," Isabel said, nudging him toward the door. "It's only a few blocks away. We might as well leave your car here and walk." The last thing she wanted was him trying to drive a car with his mind lost in another problem. He nodded. Good idea. His voice sounded like a controlled whisper, but she could tell he was quickly coming back to his senses. "Can't walk around like a giant pickle the rest of my life." She forced a laugh at his lame joke. "Makeup does wonders." He looked at her, the fear still in his eyes, but the courage coming back clearly, covering the fear, pushing it down. He blinked at her, then smiled his white teeth in stark contrast to his green lips. Yeah, green face and blue eyeliner, a new trend. This time her laugh was a little stronger. By the time they walked the 2 blocks to the hospital, they were both laughing and being very silly. At the entrance to the hospital drive, it became clear that a large number of people were affected by what was happening. Cars blocked the road and were parked up on the grass. 3 army men stood near the entrance, while other police and soldiers held post along the hospital grounds, Isabel noticed. All of them carried weapons. Oh no, Isabel said. What's the army doing here? Rob asked. Look, Isabel said, maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all. If the army's here, doesn't that make sense? Like that movie Outbreak or something? Does that mean this is deadly? Isabel shook her head and started to back away. I can't stay here. Rob grabbed her arm. Isabel, I can't do this alone. Besides, you were next to me the whole time. You might have caught this thing. I don't get sick, she said reflexively. Neither do I, he snapped. The argument was calling attention to them. One of the soldiers came over. Isabel tried to shake out of Rob's grasp, but he held on tight, and she didn't want to make a scene. Follow the driveway to the main entrance, the soldier said. And what will happen there? Isabel asked. Just follow the driveway, the man said, his voice showing no sign of compassion. He had just given them an order with no other choice. Rob pulled her slightly into motion, heading down the sidewalk toward the hospital. Looks like I'm far from the only one having this problem. Somehow this makes me feel better. Isabel only nodded. It didn't make her feel better at all. She had dealt with the government before. Having the army involved in this meant only trouble as far as she was concerned. In fact, it scared her. This wasn't the place for her to be, but there was no way she could tell Rob that now.
They were herded like cattle down a path lined by armed soldiers until they reached the front door. Inside, a man with a rifle stood beside a nurse who looked stressed. There were at least 10 other soldiers in the lobby area. Clearly, the army was afraid of green people. The question was why. The nurse asked both of their names, wrote Rob's name on one sheet and Isabel's on another. There were many names above theirs on both sheets. You go down the hall to the left and into the central court, she said to Isabel. Then she looked at Rob. This gentleman will take you to the ward on the left. The soldier standing next to the nurse nodded and pointed for Rob to follow. Not until I get some answers, Rob said. What has happened to my skin? That's what we're trying to find out, the nurse said, and we'll be able to do that faster if you help us. Isabel knew a repeated speech when she'd heard one. Clearly this had been happening for hours, more than likely the entire time they had been in the movie. Rob snorted but said nothing. Is there a reason we can't stay together? Isabel asked. Until we get some answers, the nurse said. The doctors think it's better to keep affected people separate from those who show no visible changes. Quarantine, Rob said. Yes, in a way, the nurse said, nodding. Now please go with the soldier. Behind them, the door opened and 2 more people with bright green skin entered. Isabel could tell they were clearly a couple, both in their mid-40s, both looking very worried and frightened. Rob glanced at the couple, then turned back to the nurse. Is there a way for me to call my parents? Phones are available in the ward, the nurse said. You're welcome to call your family. He nodded and looked at Isabel, clearly not knowing what to say. She could tell he did not want to be alone with this. Are there a lot of people here? She asked the nurse. Yes, the nurse said. Isabel looked at Rob, then back to the nurse. Are you sure I can't go with him? Yes, I'm sure, the nurse said. Believe me, honey, you don't want to go there. Green's not your color. Green was her color. She wore it a lot, and she was fairly sure she'd be okay, but she said nothing. It's okay, Isabel, Rob said, sounding stronger than he had. Maybe he felt better knowing that he wasn't the only one. I'll see you when this is over, Isabel said. Good, he said. I'm sorry about this. Why? She asked. It's not how I wanted our first date to end. Me either, she said softly. They stared at each other for a long moment. His eyes looked familiar at least, dark and brown and tender. Then he turned, following the soldier down the hall. Isabel watched for a moment. It seemed like Rob's skin had become even greener. He was walking with confidence, but she didn't know how much of that was bravado. How terrifying this must be for him. How terrifying it was for her. This was the worst place she could be. But the best thing she could do at the moment was follow instructions. She headed towards the open courtyard the nurse had indicated. It was a square surrounded completely by building. It had grass and trees and rocks and a lot of flower beds, some just starting to show spring growth. It also had soldiers stationed at the doors around the large square, clearly there to make sure no one got out. The soldiers stationed at the door she went through didn't even acknowledge her, not that she expected them to. From what Isabel could tell, there were about 100 people in the large courtyard, mostly sitting together in small groups talking. A few were stretched out in the sun, sleeping. Coffee and soft drinks had been placed on a table near one. near one door on the other side. She could hear a few birds chirping and people speaking softly as if a meeting was about to begin. Isabel walked towards the center, looking around. There wasn't anyone she recognized enough to talk with, and no one made eye contact with her for a very long. So she moved into the shade of a tree. There she pulled out her cell phone and dialed the number of the crash down. More than likely, whoever was there could pass the word to her family about what had happened to her. She doubted she was going to be getting out of here anytime soon. Max and Michael were going to be worried, but she was sure she could convince them to do nothing at the moment. She wasn't in any danger of being tested for anything yet. The circuits were busy. She tried again, no luck. She tried her home number, then Maria's cell phone number. The annoying busy signal followed by the helpful, digitalized female voice informing her that all circuits were busy now and that she needed to try her call later came on again. Whatever was happening was large enough to jam the phone lines, or maybe the military had jammed them. No way for her to know. All she knew was that she hated being out of touch. No one knew where she was, but she wouldn't panic. If there were a lot of green people, it would be some time before the government started testing the ones who hadn't changed color. She sat down on the grass, her back against the trunk of the tree, and watched as two more people came in. People with perfectly normal skin. Clearly here was someone whose skin had turned green. So why were only some people having this problem? Or is it going to affect all of them eventually? Somehow there was a link, a logical connection, but finding it was going to be very hard and it was going to take time. That much she was sure of. About 50 paces away, a woman said, "Oh no," very loudly. The woman stood, her arms away from her body, as if she had been dipped in something she didn't want to get onto her clothes. Her skin was starting to turn green. Those around her stepped back slightly as she stared at her arms. "I think you'd better get back into the hospital," one woman near her said, moving to help her. The greenish-tinted woman nodded, clearly in shock at what was happening to her. Isabel and the rest of the people trapped in this courtyard watched the two women as they headed towards the door, where a guard motioned for the green-skinned one to follow him, leaving the other behind. Silence filled the courtyard for a moment, then people went back to talking in hushed tones. Isabel tried the crash down number. All circuits were busy. Even with the 100 people around her, she hadn't felt this alone in a long, long time. Max really had no idea what to do next. Liz had told them her parents were out of town for the weekend, so upstairs would be as good a place as any for them to hide Maria and Alex. They had gone up there while he stayed downstairs and talked to Michael for a minute. Michael had no ideas either. "We're playing this one by ear," Michael had said, "and we're not involved at the moment, so let's try to keep it that way, okay, Maxwell?" Max had agreed. The further they stayed out of this entire mess, the better off they would be. But that still didn't answer any questions. Why hadn't Liz turned green? Why didn't this affect him and Michael and Tess? Were they just lucky, or was it their alien physiology going to make them the only white-skinned people left in the city of a few? And where was Isabel? She hadn't checked in with anyone, and that wasn't like her. She had gone on a date with some college kid earlier. Max just hoped she hadn't been affected and wasn't now trapped in the hospital by the army. The army would be testing people. If Isabel got trapped in the quarantine, she'd be in big trouble. Questions and no answers. He hated that. With Michael staying downstairs to guard the restaurant in case anyone came in, Max went upstairs to join the others. He found them all in Liz's bedroom. Maria was sitting at Liz's dressing table, staring at herself in the mirror. Liz and Alex were sitting on the bed. Tess was standing near the window. "Halloween costume for sure," Maria said, touching her green cheek and then letting go. "All I need is black lipstick and a fake nose, and then I can find a dark cape and a pointed hat. I'll make the perfect witch." "Broom," Alex said. "You forgot the broom." "If I'm still like this by next fall, I'm going to need a lot more than a broom," Maria said. She looked over at Max standing in the doorway. "So why don't you cure us?" He'd already thought of that possibility, and he didn't much like the idea after what happened in Phoenix. It was draining and gave him insights into anyone he healed. He didn't really want that much information about either Maria or Alex. And besides, he had his doubts as to the success of even trying. He glanced at Tess, who only shrugged. She clearly had no better idea either. Liz smiled at them. "No matter how much I like green, I think it might be the best idea." "You like green?" Alex asked, smiling at her, his white teeth a sharp contrast to his green lips. "Maybe I should stay like this then." "You can do what you please, but I may want my old skin back," Maria said. She looked at Max. "Please, at least give it a shot?" He nodded. "I'll try unless someone can come up with a reason why I shouldn't." No one said a word. Liz smiled at him, clearly a little worried. It wasn't dangerous, but she knew how much healing someone drained him. It had taken him a long time to recover after the Phoenix hospital visit. He moved over and put his hand on Maria, just under her chin, his palm flat against her upper chest. She leaned back and closed her eyes, bracing herself on the dressing table. No tickling, she said. Here goes, he said. No one said anything. Liz smiled at him, nodding. He closed his eyes and focused inward, letting his mind dig up the healing energy he knew lay inside of himself. Every time he did this, it felt like a heat rush, as if the energy was digging down inside his soul and pulling up strength. He sent the energy through his hand and into Maria, letting the light and feeling of it blend into the two of them, pulling them together, closer and closer. Flashes of her life snapped through his mind. Her mother through her eyes, smiling down at her when she was a child. Michael, the first time she saw him. Liz as a junior high school girl. The restaurant, school. All quick images, quick emotions, quick feelings, giving him much more information about Maria than he wanted. Then he was done. The light and energy seemed to suddenly be gone, and he stepped back, catching himself before it turned into a stagger. The strength he had felt a moment before now left him almost too weak to stand. Maria glanced at her arms, then up at Max. It didn't work. I was afraid of that, Max said, his voice soft. Why didn't it work? Liz asked, moving to stand beside him, bracing him as the energy slowly returned. Because she's not sick, Tess said. Of course. That was what Max had been afraid of. He let himself lean against Liz as his strength slowly came back. They had been thinking of this problem as a disease simply because the skin changed, but no one had actually complained about any aches or pains. What do you mean I'm not sick? Maria's voice rose. I'm green. You don't get much sicker than that. Your skin was pale before, Tess said, staring at her. So, Maria asked, glancing at first at Tess and then at Max. He didn't have the energy to give her an answer at the moment. Paler than mine, Alex said, sighing. I understand green skin doesn't mean you're sicker now than when your skin was pure white with freckles, or any sicker than a black person or anyone with any skin color. I'm green, Maria shouted. I wasn't green, and now I am. That has to mean something's wrong, doesn't it? Doesn't mean you're sick, however, Alex said. Come on, Alex, Maria said, turning to him. Aren't you freaked out by this? By you being green? You know what I mean. She held out her arms. Look at me, look at us. This is clearly an illness. If you had been sick, Max said, I would have been able to cure it. It would seem, Tess said, that green just may be now your natural color. That's not funny, Maria said. It wasn't supposed to be, Tess said.
Chapter 4. Ouch, Alex said, shaking his arm. Oh, you big baby, Liz said, laughing. She had just taken a very thin skin sample from him and was going to try to compare his skin with a sample of her skin under a microscope. She figured at this point there was no use in just sitting around. No one was coming in the restaurant. Maria was still sitting at the dressing table, staring at her green face, and Max and Tess had gone downstairs to talk with Michael and see if they could get in contact with Isabel. She had felt she needed to do something. She had no doubt that she would find anything different than anyone else, but she at least wanted to see what was happening with Alex and Maria's skin. She had studied skin color in science class a year ago, and she had found it fascinating. She had no idea that her old textbook and interest in skin color would come in handy this way. Well, it hurt, Alex said. Just because it's green doesn't mean it doesn't have nerve endings. I never would have guessed, she said, patting his knee before adjusting the slide. I took the same amount off of my arm, so we're even. Women deal with pain better, Alex said. We don't whine about it as much, that's for sure, Maria said. Liz, what kind of makeup do you have? Nothing that will cover your green, Liz said, not looking up from her work. She didn't want to be distracted right now. My base is really light, Maria said. Yours would be darker. It might work. I don't wear base, Liz said. Maria leaned towards the mirror. Maybe you should try some of that white stuff, Alex said. You know, like kabuki actors? Kabuki actors, Maria asked. Or goth chicks, Liz said. She finished creating the slide. She had to be careful because the two samples were both small and very thin, and she had put them very close together on the slide. You have some of that? Maria asked. No, Liz said, making the word into two syllables. Now leave me alone. I'm working here. Yeah, Maria said. Like you can find stuff the experts can't. Come on, Maria, Alex said. Liz has information the experts don't have. Like the fact that there are aliens in Roswell? Yeah, Alex said. Are we blaming this on aliens too then? Maria said. Do you think a friend of the skin's poisoned the water supply? Anything's possible, Alex said quietly. After all, it is the skin that's changing. Are we blaming this on aliens too then? Maria said. Do you think a friend of the skin's poisoned the water supply? Anything's possible, Alex said quietly. After all, it is the skin that's changing. Liz felt a shudder run through her. Remember when I asked for that silence thing? You just asked us to leave you alone, Maria said. Mind if I dig through your makeup drawer? Liz did mind. She didn't say anything. Right now, she wanted to concentrate, and if her makeup kept Maria quiet, then that would help. Carefully, she put the slide on her microscope. Max used to tease her about the microscope, saying it wasn't normal equipment for most high school kids, but then she wasn't most high school kids. From what you remember from class, the pigment-producing cells on humans were on the surface layers of skin. These cells were stuck between the normal skin cells in what you remember being the basal layer of the epidermis. In other words, not very deep, thank heavens for Alex. He would have really complained if she had to take off all 7 layers. The skin cells that created color were called melanocytes. They synthesized a pigment called melanin that reflected light, something to change the property of those cells in Alex's skin, causing the pigments to reflect light in such a fashion that made his skin look green. Carefully, she moved the slide into position and adjusted the focus. Nothing at all looked abnormal with any cells in Alex's skin. The 2 samples were basically the same, except his showed green melanin in the cells and hers normal colored melanin. This was going to be a lot harder for the scientists to solve than she had first imagined. Well, Alex asked. I don't see anything obvious, she said. And this microscope isn't powerful enough to really get down inside the cellular level. But it's normal. There's nothing normal about this color, Maria said. It's normal, Liz said, reassuring him as much as she could under the circumstances. Except the melanin pigments in your cells are somehow reflecting light in such a way as to make it look green. What would cause a skin cell to change like that? Yeah, good question, Maria said. I have no idea, Liz said, glancing up at Alex and over at Maria. It might not be the cell. It might be the melanin. Green is a combination of blue and yellow light bands. Yellow and different shades of brown are normal melanin-reflected colors, but blue isn't, and neither is green. Okay, Alex said, holding up his hand for her to stop. You lost me a few colors back. What exactly is this melanin stuff? Oh, science class, Maria said. Liz laughed and explained. Melanin is the pigment put out by your skin's melanocyte cells. Melanocyte cells, Alex asked. They are like little pigment factories, Liz said, scattered throughout the rest of your skin cells. Got it, Alex said. Even I got that, Maria said. Liz went on. The pigment is bound to a protein after it is produced to form what are called melanosomes. Those are spread out over your skin layer to give it color. Mostly, this entire system is designed to protect the human body from ultraviolet rays. Wow, now you lost me, Alex said. What makes one person's skin real pale like Maria's and another person's dark? Is it the number of these mela things? Actually, no, Liz said. All of us, no matter what our skin tone, have about the same amount of pigment-producing melanocyte cells. You're kidding, Maria said. You're sure I'm not short on them, since my skin is usually so pale? Nope, Liz said. What makes the difference is genetic programming in the cells. At birth, our bodies are set to produce a certain amount of pigment. How much of that pigment is spread around over your skin is also already determined. The more pigment, the darker the color, the greater the protection from ultraviolet. So what causes a suntan? Alex asked. From what I remember, Liz said, proud of the fact that this information had sunk in from last year, when too much ultraviolet radiation hits the melanin, it oxidizes and darkens, and at the same time causes the melanocyte cells to produce more melanin and thicken the skin. It's a natural skin protection system. The darker the skin, the more resistance to burns. So I sunburn easily because I have very little of this pigment stuff in my skin? Maria asked. Yes, Liz said. Geez, Maria said. Someone should find a way to bottle this stuff. It would be better than suntan lotion. Maybe they have, Alex said. Liz looked up, feeling appalled. You think someone did this on purpose? I don't know what to think, he said. I'm sure I'd find sign of it, Liz said, but she wasn't, not really. So what might cause a color change like this? Alex asked, holding out his arm and looking at the green skin. I honestly have no idea, Liz said. There's some change to how the light is reflected by the melanin, that's for sure. If I remember right, the pituitary glands put out hormones that cause pigment formation in the melanocyte cells. It might be something there. Pituitary glands? Alex asked, looking discouraged. This is going to be difficult, isn't it? I'm afraid so, Liz said. I have no idea what's causing the change, and there are real scientists with better equipment working on this right now, I'm sure. Sorry, that was my dryer going off. I'm going to start again. I'm afraid so, Liz said. I have no idea what's causing the change, and there are real scientists with better equipment working on this right now, I'm sure. I hope so, Alex said. Me too, Maria said, no offense. So do I, Liz said, going back to studying the cells under her microscope, looking for anything that might give her a clue. But nothing was there. The two samples, except for color, looked strikingly the same. Then suddenly blue cells appeared on the side where before there had been none. Each blue cell surrounded a pigment-producing melanocyte cell. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Cells couldn't just appear in a skin sample like that. It wasn't possible. Any luck? Max asked, appearing in the doorway. I know more about skin coloring than I ever want to know, Maria said. Liz looked up at Max, trying to make herself focus. The only thing that had changed for us was him coming into the room. Somehow his presence had coincided with cells that had been invisible before appearing. But that didn't seem possible. If she asked for a skin sample, Alex said, don't let her take it. She's a menace. Oh, poor baby, Maria said. Liz ignored their banter, trying to get her mind to focus on what she had just seen. She looked back into the microscope. The blue cells were still there. She had to find out if her barely formed theory was right. She looked at Max. Go back to the top of the stairs and stand there until I call you back. Max frowned, confused. What? Just do it, Liz said. She didn't want to explain anything until she made sure. I want to test something. Max glanced at Alex and shrugged, then turned and left. You've gone nuts, haven't you? Maria asked. Maybe, but I have a hunch, Liz said. After a moment, Max shouted, I'm at the stairs! She looked back through the microscope at her two samples. The blue cells covering the pigment-producing cells in Alex's green skin were gone, as if they had never been there. Or more than likely, they were still there, but she just couldn't see them with the equipment she was using. Keeping her eyes on the slide, she shouted, All right, come back in. I hope you're not just having fun with me, he said, entering the room again. As he did, the blue cells covering Alex's pigment-producing cells in the skin sample reappeared. Somehow Max's presence made them visible. She looked up at Max, the shock of what she was thinking making her short of breath. What? Max asked. Yeah, what? Alex asked. Something changed? Max is back in the room, Maria said. That's a change. This skin thing is alien-related, Liz said, blurting out the thought that had been forming in her mind. No way, Max said. Why would you think that? Take a look, Liz said, moving carefully not to bump the microscope in its setting as she moved aside. Alex's skin sample is on the left, mine is on the right. Max leaned in and studied the image of the two skin samples through the microscope. There's a blue cell over some of the cells in Alex's skin sample. They are covering the pigment-producing melanocyte cells, clearly doing something to alter the pigment, Liz said. What? Alex said. I thought you told me there was nothing different between the two samples except for color. She looked at him. There wasn't. Max glanced up from the microscope, a look of understanding on his face, until I came into the room. Exactly, Liz said. Your presence lit them up somehow so that I could see them. Damn, Max said, moving back and letting Liz take up her position. The room was silent as she studied the blue cells. There was something about them that looked familiar, very familiar. She just couldn't put her finger on it. So why would blue cells turn my skin green? Alex asked. I have no idea why these blue cells are there, Liz said, not looking up from the blue cells. Somehow it is changing the pigment that is being produced and spread over your skin. There's not a great distance in color between yellow and green. Just add blue, Alex said. It would seem that way, Liz said. So where did this blue cell come from? Max asked. Suddenly, Max's question brought the answer to what looked familiar about the cell's home. These cells were very similar to the blue stuff that had been in the cave. Sorry, I was checking the chat. The girls are saying the crystals, so just making sure there's no sound issues. Yes. Okay. A cave, she said. She looked around at the stunned expressions on her friends. She felt the same way. They had thought they were finished with those blue crystals when they melted, freeing Alex and Kyle from the cave a few weeks before, but now it seemed they were far from done with that adventure. I was wondering where all that stuff was going to when it melted, Alex said. We couldn't be so lucky as to have it just go away. No, we couldn't, Liz said. Figures, Maria said. She rolled her eyes and leaned against Liz's dresser. It was raining that day, wasn't it? Max asked. Hard, Alex confirmed. So the melted blue crystals were washed down into the water too, Max said. And right into my drinking water, Alex said. Mine too, Maria said. We live close to you. Not only yours, Liz said, but an entire section of the town gets their water from wells in that area. The four of them sat there in stunned silence. All Liz could think was how many people had been drinking the contaminated water, and how many of them were going to turn green before this was all over. Okay, that was chapter 4. Dun, 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 dun.
Could you imagine them trying to do this episode with everybody turning green? There's no way they could.
That'd be a lot of time in the makeup in the hair room. Like that.
Well, and this came out way before, like, I mean, we had digital effects, but they weren't as good as they are now. I don't think it would have worked as well.
Probably not. They would have had to use a lot of, like, green makeup or something.
Yeah, that would be awful.
A lot of green body makeup, I guess. Like, they would have spray painted them green or something. I don't know what they would have done.
It all looked like Gamora walking around.
Oh, we gotta let Allie back in. Jeez, it's fun. I had to say a lot of interesting scientific words that I was not prepared for. So, melanocyte. I don't even know if I said any of that right, but whatever. Some scientific information.
How do you think they're going to fix this? What do you think they're going to do? Because we know that Max can't heal them because they're not sick. So how are they going to do it?
Right? Right? What are they going to do? Find the crystals or something?
It has to do with crystal.
They gotta find that jellyfish thing that was like really freaky.
That's already dead though. They already blasted it, right? Because that's what made them, right? So that's gone.
Well, the next chapter is only 10 pages. Let's see, I'm looking. Oh yeah, the next chapters are pretty short. They're like, take us 10 minutes probably to read each chapter, the next ones. Unless y'all want us to read more, so.
Oh, girl, no.
Michelle's like, no, I'm over it tonight.
My throat. I have really bad allergies and it's bad here, so I get through that 10 pages and I'm like, ah. Plus it gives Jess more time to tell us
Oh, yes.
all her hopes and dreams.
Did you guys see my purse?
I did.
I
show
would love to see the scene with Max getting all those flashes from Maria and trying to heal her. I would love to see that on screen, actually.
Yeah, I would too. And you would think that would make them closer, because every time he does that, he gets closer to people, but you don't really see. I mean, they do a little bit, but it's not really.
Well, they have a friendship on the show, so kind of get closer.